everyone, welcome back. This week we are going to be talking about how we measure crime and victimization. So as always, please make sure that you are following along, taking notes. You have access to this PowerPoint, and we will begin. So I always like to start off with a question just to kind of get you to think. But why do we need to measure crime and victimization? Why is it important for us to be able to do this? Are crime rates and victimization rates the same? Can they be measured the same? Why or why not? The level of crime victimization in a community, as well as people's perceptions of safety, impact directly or indirectly their quality of life. So no matter if their perceptions are accurate, they're still going to react to what their perceptions are. Having statistical data allows us to make generalizations around trends in order to help mold policymaking decisions. In essence, it helps us make informed decisions. We have to have that data in order to make informed policies, informed procedures, informed life decisions. So that's why it's important for us to measure crime. So let's look at how we measure crime. There are many ways that we measure crime and ways that we measure victimization. You have on your screen right now several of the top tools that we utilize. Of course, when we're measuring crime, we always utilize the Uniform Crime Report. There's also incident-based systems or the National Incident-Based System. We also use prisoner statistics, and we're going to talk a little bit about that because that may be something that is new to you. But then we also have certain tools that we use to measure victimization in and of itself. We'll talk a little bit about why the UCR and the NIBRS is not necessarily the best tools to measure victimization. So to measure victimization, we have the National Victimization Surveys, and we're going to talk kind of about the evolution of those surveys and kind of what we have today that's the gold standard in victimization surveys. And then you also do have the international victimization surveys that are international bound. The Uniform Crime Report, or the UCR, is probably the one that you have heard about the most, the measuring tool that you have heard about the most. So we're going to kind of go into some detail around what it is, in case you haven't, and some of the benefits and some of the limitations of the UCR. But the UCR typically is utilized to measure crime. Essentially, the UCR began in 1931 and was a result of the Wickersham Commission. President Herbert Hoover convened this commission to address issues of crime in general, and the commission, through its study, recommended and proposed a comprehensive national criminal justice statistical program to measure crime, and that's where the UCR kind of came into play, and they developed the Uniform Crime Report. The UCR collects basic information about the most serious crimes committed. Those crimes are broken down into Part 1 crimes and Part 2 crimes. So Part 1 crimes are your common and serious crimes. Part 2 crimes are your less common and less serious. And in just a minute, on the next slide, I will show you exactly what crimes fall into Part 1 and what crimes fall into Part 2. But with the UCR, law enforcement reports their statistics to the FBI on a yearly basis, and that's what accounts for the data that is collected into the UCR. So, of course, these crimes are the ones that are most likely to be reported by law enforcement. Now, when the UCR first came about, participation was not mandatory. However, over the years that the UCR has been in place, there has been increasingly mandatory obligations from law enforcement to participate. And so now we do see that it is mandatory for law enforcement to report these crimes to the federal government. One of the major drawbacks to the UCR is this hierarchy rule. And the UCR is governed by this hierarchy rule. So what the hierarchy rule says is that only the most serious crimes committed during an incident is counted. So if you have an armed robbery that winds up in a death, only the death will be reported through to the UCR because it is the greater of the two crimes. So inherently, the UCR doesn't capture all the crimes in each incident. It is strictly the most serious crimes because of this hierarchy rule. And here you can kind of see, I took this from, this was a table from my introduction to criminal justice class when we talk about this, but it breaks down part 1 crimes and part 2 crimes really fantastic. So I wanted to share it with you. You can see that part 1 crimes are really like your murders, your rapes, robberies, burglaries, sex trafficking, human trafficking, things like that. Your part 2 crimes are your least lesser offenses. So that's like your drug violations, prostitution, vandalism, things like that. The UCR does have its advantages in data collection. So again, it is mandatory data collection. So data is compiled from all over the United States annually. And UCR lays out standardized crime definitions. So there's no guesswork involved as to does this crime fit this definition. It's standardized throughout the United States. And large amounts of data are collected providing for patterns of crime and criminals through the UCR. There are some inherent disadvantages to the UCR. So we've talked about the hierarchy rule, which is one of the major disadvantages. But statistics are reported for the crimes only. So what that means is in the UCR, we don't get details around the criminal or the victim. We only get information and statistics around the crime itself. Again, the hierarchy rule is into effect. So if there are multiple crimes committed in an incident, you only get the most information on the most serious crime, and that other crime in the incident is lost a lot. Data may be more consistent with the types of offenses that police pursue and not necessarily helping us understand true crime. Because again, these are only offenses that are known to police because police are the ones that are reporting this crime. So in essence, you've heard of this, hopefully, but the biggest critique of the UCR is that it doesn't capture these dark figures of crime. And essentially these dark figures are those unreported crimes. So we know that victims don't always report crimes that have been perpetrated against them. So the biggest disadvantage of the UCR is it doesn't capture those crimes that are unreported or dark figures. That doesn't give us a true picture of what crime is happening. And it doesn't give us a picture of true victimization and the impacts of crime. So we've talked about the UCR with some of its advantages and disadvantages. And so now we're going to turn our attention to the National Incident-Based Reporting System. So we know that the UCR only captures those crimes that are reported to the police and only the most serious crime within the incident. So the federal government basically kind of saw some of these limitations in crime statistics and developed the NIBRS, which is the National Incident-Based Reporting System. NIBRS collects data on crimes known to the police, but the data are not aggregated. And that is very important. I have it on the slide twice because it is very important. With the NIBRS, it's disaggregated. So you get all the information. We don't clump all of it together and just report on one crime. You get a little bit more information on each incident itself. So data is collected on 53 different dimensions, including specific offenses, victim and offender characteristics, and the type of property lost or recovered. Guys, this is huge. The NIBRS is the first federal data collection tool that we have that really kind of told us some information around victim and offender characteristics. We started to see major focus on the incidents themselves instead of the most serious crime. So we could kind of dive in a little bit deeper with the NIBRS to find information that we needed. There's a range of offenses on which data are collected, was expanded from the UCR. And again, we'll say data is not aggregated, which is very important with the NIBRS. You have the incident information, and you as a researcher can go in there and find the information that you need because it collects information on these different dimensions of crime. So with the UCR, you saw that you had Part 1 crimes and Part 2 crimes. The NIBRS does group crimes together. They cluster them, as we like to say, into Group A and Group B. So your Group A offenses include 22 crimes covering 46 offenses, including homicide and robbery. So again, your Group A cluster is your most serious crimes. Then you have Group B, which are 11 offenses that include loitering. Here are some advantages of the NIBRS from your book, and it does a really great job of kind of collecting and giving this to us in a simple chart. So you can see that distinctions can be made between attempted versus completed crimes. Arrest and clearance rates are linked to specific incidents of offenses. You have details on individual crime incidents, which is huge. You can get information on the offenses, the offenders, the victims. And then there's no hierarchy rule because every offense during an incident is reported and provided that the incidents are separate and distinct. So I wanted to kind of just take a moment and review what we've learned a little bit about some of the challenges that we face in measuring crime, because these first two tools that we've talked about, the UCR and the NIBRS, are tools utilized to measure crime. There's some definitional challenges when it comes to figuring out crime definitions. The UCR does lay out some definitions, but those are typically vague and vary between jurisdictions. But then we also have these reporting challenges. So the production of data for crime databases relies on the participation of victims, witnesses, and law enforcement. There are several factors that go into play when we look at these reporting challenges. So there has to be an awareness that a crime has been committed. The victim has to know that they have been a victim of a crime. Citizens must define the crime as worthy of police involvement. So in order for a crime to be reported, essentially think of it as, in order for a crime to be reported, what has to happen? So we have to know that a crime has happened. Everyone has to understand that the crime happened. Victims have to realize the seriousness of the crime. We see a lot of times in domestic violence or intimate partner violence situations that victims don't report because they don't really see the seriousness of the situation in those incidents. So you have to have a victim who won't downplay their victimization. And then the people have to have confidence in the police that they will do something. If they're going to report it, there has to be confidence the police will mitigate the danger from that crime. So all of that kind of goes into the perception of crime. And then the last variable with reporting challenges is once a crime is reported, that information has to get to the individuals that are responsible for reporting it to the feds. And so when we talk about this, there are several times that police officers will be called to a scene of a crime and not necessarily do incident reports. Or it takes months for incident reports to get done. So sometimes the information of crime may not get to the appropriate parties for reporting purposes. And then finally, I just wanted to kind of bring into your purview that some police practices may inherent challenges when measuring crime. So policing reports are not uniform. Every department jurisdiction kind of measures different things. So you can have different measuring on response times to a call. Some jurisdictions may keep track of that data, some may not. Level of professionalism. How do you measure professionalism? And how does professionalism affect public confidence? Arresting practices. Now, we can measure some arresting practices as long as we have clear definitions of what we are measuring. However, there's not uniform arresting practices throughout the nation. Each jurisdiction has different arresting practices that has to be taken into account whenever we measure crime. Another tool that we have to measure crime is the National Prisoner Statistics Program, so the NPS. This is a tool that is not widely known through undergrad, but that's why I wanted to kind of highlight this, because we can get some information from prisoners. Essentially, the NPS exists to determine the physical capacity, staffing, and programming needs of prison facilities, to identify and analyze major issues and trends in corrections related to facilities, such as the influence of sentencing patterns on occupancy, and then to obtain information on special issues such as the number of inmate deaths related to HIV or other number of inmates that are illegal aliens. So crime can be measured by the collection of prisoner data, and there are mechanisms to do that, such as the NPS in the United States. Essentially, the NPS aims to provide national and state level data on the number of prisoners in state and federal prisons. So when we get this data from the NPS, it includes things such as like personal characteristics of the prisoners, types of offenses, and time in prison. With the NPS, there are two aspects to the NPS. So you have the census and you have the survey. The census requires participation of every prison and correctional facility in the United States. Everyone participates in the NPS. The survey includes a representative sample of the facilities and a random sampling of inmates from those facilities. And that's where we gather the data from, is from the surveys. There are some significant challenges when trying to find data to help us understand crime using the NPS. The NPS does not allow for generalization of findings to all offenders because the survey is limited to only those offenders currently incarcerated. So the purpose typically of most research is so that we can kind of find trends that are able to be generalized. Sorry, that word is very hard, guys. That is able to be generalized to some common public. We can't do that with the NPS because one of the inherent flaws of the NPS is only those prisoners that were caught, sentenced, and are currently incarcerated are part of the sample. So that leaves out all of those people who commit crime that never get arrested or are never incarcerated or that got released from incarceration before the reporting period. So there's a lack of sufficient data to make conclusions about the causes of crime as well. Different jurisdictions also have different policies and procedures. Therefore, there is no general interpretation modality utilizing the NPS. So the UCR, the NIBRS, and the NPS are all tools that we have at our disposal to kind of track and monitor crime. Each of them have their advantages and each of them have some significant disadvantages. And remember, so far, most of this has been looking at offender data. When we talked about kind of history of victimology and things like that, we noted in our theoretical underpinnings, we noted that victims were not really a focus a lot of times up until recent times. And so our old ways of measuring crime and measuring victimization really relied on us measuring crime. The NIBRS was instituted and kind of gave us that first little taste of information around the victims themselves. But again, we had a revolution, I would say, into wanting to know more about victims. So we saw kind of the rise around the recognition of victimization and victimology in the recent decades. And so we kind of turned our attention to wanting to know more about the victim's experience in crime. And we do that through what are known as victimization surveys. Now, with victimization surveys, they are composed of interview reports from a random sample of people and begin with asking whether a person has ever been a victim of a crime. So, essentially, these surveys, and they've evolved from their first implementation to what we see now, but it's a very general, random sample of people asking, hey, have you ever been a victim of a crime? If they say yes, then they continue with the survey. If they say no, they end the survey. These surveys estimate the overall risk of becoming a victim, and they monitor trends in crime victimization over time and across different geographical locations. Essentially, crime victimization surveys contribute to understanding long-term outcomes of victims of crime. You can see here some advantages of victim surveys in measuring crime. It kind of gives us some disaggregated data around crime causation. It helps us in building victimology theory in our theoretical framework. It helps us kind of have a better response system to the victims. So victimization surveys let us know what victims experience so that we can kind of tailor resources to them. And it gives us a better overall profile of victims and offenders in helping us understand crime and criminal behavior. Now, victimization surveys are best understood as generations or stages. We did not pop out a perfect victimization survey on the first go. We have taken steps each time we do victimization surveys to better those surveys to get better results. So each stage sought to improve that methodology. But let's start and kind of talk about the first generation. The first generation occurred when President Lyndon B. Johnson initiated the Presidential Commission to see what victims' experiences with crime in the justice system were. The results of the first victimization survey pilot showed that depending on the type of crime, there were 3 to 10 times as many crimes reported by victims than were reported by the UCR. Let that sink in. The first generation of victimization surveys showed us the importance and the major downfall of the UCR. It showed us that those dark figures of crimes were real. Those unreported crimes were greater than the reported crimes. And essentially, the data that we had with the UCR was inaccurate. And we can make some very bad decisions with inaccurate data. So this survey highlighted the magnitude of unreported crime, those dark figures, and essentially showed us that we needed to undertake the task of talking to victims in order to gather as much data on crime as possible, because not only did these surveys help us understand the victim's experience, it really kind of gave us a better picture of crime overall, because it was capturing those unreported crimes. The second generation survey sought to correct the problems identified in the first generation survey. So we see more records checks and cross-referencing between victim experience and their interviews and police reporting. And so that lists that out here that you can read. But this second generation survey showed us something known as memory decay. Now, I want you to think about a couple questions. What did you have for breakfast this morning? You got an answer? Pretty easy to remember maybe what you had for breakfast this morning. Now, what did you have for breakfast this time, same day, last week? That gets a little harder, right? So now I want you to think about, what did you have for breakfast this same day, this same week, 3 months ago? Are you rolling your eyes? Because I roll my eyes. Like, it's really hard to remember that far back, right? Well, that's what the second generation of victim surveys kind of showed us. It showed us that victims undergo something known as memory decay. And essentially, memory decay is the further from the event that you get, the less likely that the victim is to recall the details of that event. By doing reverse records checks, it was found that the best memory recall was within 3 months. So you had about a 3-month time span for victims to recall the most information that they really could on those incidents without it being totally eroded. That was huge because that kind of taught us how to survey victims and how long we needed to let them kind of sit before we initiated those conversations and followed up on those conversations. That brings us to the third generation crime surveys. The third generation survey was known as the National Crime Survey, and it was initiated in 1972, and it sampled about 72,000 households. Those households were contacted every 6 months for a total of 7 interviews, and many of the concerns from first and second generations were addressed and corrected at this stage. So you can see that we're tending to build upon what we've learned in the past. We come to fourth generation victim surveys. These surveys were really kind of the last generation until we kind of perfected what we have now. We kind of honed in on wording and memory decay in these surveys from the third generation. The fourth generation redesigned their efforts to address the questionnaire itself to make sure that the wording was as clear as possible and things like that. The fourth generation surveys were utilized until 1990. And in 1990, we officially developed the National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS, which is now what we utilize today. So you can see the effort from Lyndon Johnson's presidency all the way up until the 90s to kind of focus our attention on victims, their experience, and kind of learning from each survey of those victims how to better gather data that we needed. And then that brings us to the NCVS. The NCVS was designed with 4 primary objectives. The first one was to develop detailed information about the victims and consequences of crime. Then we wanted to estimate the number and types of crimes that are not reported to police. Because remember, that was a major pitfall of all of our crime surveys or our crime databases, the UCR, the NIBRS, is it still didn't account for those dark figures of crime. So the NCVS really sought to capture those dark figures in our surveying methodologies. Then we wanted to provide uniform measures of selecting types of crimes that we surveyed. And then it permits comparisons over time and types of areas. So the NCVS is a national representative survey of victims, and it's our primary source of info about frequency, characteristics, and consequences of violence. With the NCVS, there is random sampling, and once a household is picked, all members ages 12 and above are interviewed. Those interviews are every 6 months for a 3-year time span. The first and fifth interview are held in person. So it is a person-to-person interview, face-to-face interview. All of the other interviews are held via phone. That's a little bit about the methodology. So the NCVS really utilizes 2 instruments, and it helps us identify trends and has high response rates realistically when we look at it. But there are some limitations. So again, anyone who is under 12 is not interviewed. So there is a limited age coverage and a limited population coverage. Not everyone likes to be in surveys. There may be some methodological issues around how we're identifying those people and things like that. But no matter the limitations, the NCVS gives us some great information. So on this screen now, you see the 2015 summary of the NCVS. And it really kind of helped us understand victims a little bit better. So when we look at gender, we find that men are more likely to be victims of serious violent crimes, but we're less likely than women to be victims of violent crimes in general. So when violent crimes were serious, murder, things like that, men were more likely the victims. However, violent crime in general, the trend was women were more likely to be victimized than men. Ages. It helped us realize that the older you are, the less likely you are to be a victim of violent crime, which is mind-boggling to some because that's not necessarily how the media portrays it, but according to the data from the NCVS, that is a true statement now, and it continues to trend that way. We talked about in our, I think, second meeting together, who's more likely to be a victim of crime, and it's your young African American males who live in a urban area, high crime area, are more likely to be victims of violent crime. So here you can kind of see the racial breakdown of crime and of who is more likely to be victimized, kind of goes along the same instances. And then location, I found this very interesting. In 2015, rates of violent crime were highest in the nation's western states and cities. So if you lived on the West Coast or in western states, you typically had higher crime rates than the eastern states. There are some challenges associated with the NCVS. No tool is perfect. You see, it took us 4 kind of tries to tailor the NCVS, and some of these tools have actually undergone some additional changes in recent years to kind of better their accuracy. So the first challenge that we see with the NCVS is sampling. So researchers try to target representative samples. However, a lot of researchers utilize like phones. And so inherently, not everyone answers their phone. Some utilize landlines, and that is inherently flawed because not everyone has a landline. And those who have cell phones, you are not truly getting a representative sample. You're only getting a sample of those people who have phones and who answer their phones. Then you have just the participation aspect. Like I said earlier, not everyone wants to participate in surveys. I know I keep getting surveys from the National Health Institute, and I just keep trashing them because I don't really want to participate. So you do have some of those dynamics in play with your sampling. Another challenge that we see is recall. So we talked about memory decay, and recall really is about the same. So respondents are able to recall more accurately events that occurred within the last 3 months rather than like 6 months ago. So timing of follow-up from the incident is key to getting as much information as you can. Then we have this issue of telescoping. And telescoping is essentially when a respondent includes events from before the reference period. So again, these surveys are looking at like the past 6 months or past 3 months. But some people, due to memory decay, recall issues, may events outside of those dynamics into those months. And so we try to account for telescoping through the use of something called bounding. And bounding is essentially comparing incidents reported in an interview with incidents reported in previous interviews. So it's basically looking back at previous notes to see if that incident had already been reported in these surveys. And if it had, you strike that and you don't count it again. We talked a little bit about bounding, but essentially measuring repeated victimizations can be difficult. The NIBRS, if you're looking at crime, the National Incident-Based Reporting System reports on different incidents as long as they are same. With repeated victimization, you get a better picture of repeated victimization through the NCVS because it's the victims explaining their victimization, essentially. And so you do have to make sure through bounding that no telescoping is happening, but you get a better picture of repeated victimizations. And then there are various data interpretation challenges. So collecting, coding, and processing of statistical data. Our analysis is always subject to interpretation based on how we code the data. And so most studies go through peer reviews and things like that to kind of ensure that everyone is on the same page and in agreement with collection methodology, coding methodology, and things like that. We went over a lot today. I hope that you all have learned something. Like I said, this will be timestamped so that you can go back and kind of, if you need to go back and re-listen to anything or anything like that. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week.